Chapter 61, Sea of Ash. In the morning, Sunny woke up feeling grim and uneasy. The memory of the frightening dark mirror was still fresh in his mind, making every shadow seem sinister and foreboding. He scowled sullenly. What the hell? I'm the child of shadows. Why do I have to be afraid of my own domain? But then again, darkness and shadow were not the same, even if a lot of people tended to mistake one for another. Shadows were born from the absence of light. In a sense, they were manifestations of emptiness. True. Darkness, on the other hand, true darkness was its own entity. In a sense, shadows shared more in common with light than they did with darkness. I guess they do. Do they? Philosophical debates with his internal monologue were not the best way to start the day, at least as far as Sunny was concerned. His already sour mood only got worse. With a short sigh, he sat up and stretched his arms. Yawning, good morning. The sound of his voice was almost drowned by the echoing noise of rushing water. With the sun rising, the dark sea was in a hurry to retreat. Sunny was finally able to relax a little. Morning. Nephis had been guarding the camp during the latter part of the night, so she was already awake. As usual, she was meditating with her eyes closed. In the absolute darkness of the night, watching over something actually meant listening for suspicious sounds, so keeping one's eyes open was not that useful. For everyone except Sunny, that is, who had perfect night vision thanks to his attributes. Hearing him stand up, Changing Star slowly opened her eyes. A soft afterglow left behind by the dancing white flame could still be seen in their depth, quickly disappearing as her sight adjusted to the twilight of dawn. She looked at Sunny and offered him a polite smile. In the past 2 weeks, Nephis had also been training, perhaps even more diligently than him. However, she wasn't trying to improve her swordsmanship. She was actually trying to learn how to behave like a normal human. As the result, their interactions had become slightly less awkward. For the most part, Sunny was able to recognize Changing Star's efforts because they were very similar to a phase he himself had gone through many years ago. On several occasions, he had caught her intently observing how Cassie talked and behaved around them. Sometime later, Neph would randomly try to mimic small details of her friend's behavior. The results were a mixed bag, to say the least. The first time she tried to greet him with a smile in the morning, Sunny panicked and almost summoned the Azure Blade. However, Nephis was very smart and persistent. Today, her polite smile looked almost natural. He had no idea why Changing Star decided to work on her social skills. Of all things, during their perilous journey through the monster-infested hellscape that was the Forgotten Shore, but he didn't mind. It was actually rather entertaining to watch. Watching her torture herself every day, enduring terrible pain in hopes of learning to better control her aspect ability, on the contrary, was not fun at all. They never talked about it, but Sunny knew that every time Nephis pretended to meditate, she was actually subjecting herself to the excruciating agony of her flaw. When he thought about it, his heart ached. Sunny wasn't used to feeling such things, but he suspected that this was what other people called compassion. At least it was similar to how it was described in books and dramas, not that he knew a lot about that stuff. After they had breakfast, Nephis stood up and looked at the beam of light falling through the nearest gap between giant vertebrae. Turning to Sunny, she said, "Let's study the surroundings." They needed to get the lay of the land and decide on their next step. Usually, that implied looking for the nearest natural features that were high enough to stay above the surface of the sea and deciding on which one they would try to reach next. Then came a day or two of scouting and hunting, followed by moving the camp to that feature. Sunny gave her a nod. All right. He summoned the Echo to guard Cassie while they were away and left the shadow behind to keep an eye out, just in case something happens. Then, Sunny followed Nephis to the gap. Boosting her, he watched as Changing Star flew through the air and then seemingly ran up the wall, kicking herself off at the last moment and propelling her body even higher before grabbing onto a bone protrusion. Relying only on her upper body strength, she then climbed up and disappeared into the cascading light. Soon, the golden rope fell down, allowing him to follow. Nephis helped him climb atop the gargantuan's spine and then straightened. Turning to take a look west, Sunny shook his hands and did the same, expecting to see the usual picture, an endless expanse of the crimson labyrinth dotted here and there with rare high points. However, what they saw left them both speechless. Some distance away, the labyrinth seemed to lose color. The crimson blades of coral stood gray and misshapen, as though struck by some unknown disease and drained of all life. The stone-like material looked brittle and fragile, ready to crumble to dust at any moment. The patch of dead coral spread for as far as the eye could see. Further away, the walls of the labyrinth seemed to have collapsed into a sea of ash-gray sand. This ashen wasteland looked so alien and strange after weeks of seeing only the endless crimson pathways that Sonny felt a shiver run down his spine. The fact that they didn't notice even a single monster moving through the mud beneath made him feel even more disturbed. There was only one visible high point to the west of them. Far away into the distance, the ground rose, forming a tall hill. The hill was probably the largest they had seen, easily capable of becoming a real island once the water rose in the night. Its shape reminded Sonny of a colossal barrow. Covered in the gray sand left behind by dead coral, the hill resembled a mountain of ash. That mountain was crowned by a giant tree. The tree rose into the sky like a tower, its branches wide enough to cover the whole island in their shade. The bark of the giant tree was as black as the water of the dark sea, while its leaves were red as blood. Contrasted against the gray sky, the crimson crown of the majestic tree looked incredibly vibrant and magnificent. Sonny gulped. What the hell is that? Nephi's was either thinking or had nothing to say. She just stared into the distance, a slight frown on her face. At that moment, something glistened brightly from beneath the tree. The glimmer was clear and easily visible even from their position, like a beam of sunlight reflected by a large mirror. A moment later, it was gone, only to appear again after a few seconds. A mirror. Sonny shivered, remembering the previous night. For some reason, the bright glimmer suddenly seemed to become menacing. After some time had passed, he addressed Neph again. What do you think? She lingered a bit before turning to him. While changing star was deliberating on what to say, he glanced at the ashen wasteland again. Finally, she spoke. This is the only way west. Sonny grimaced and looked away. He didn't like this turn of events one bit. So, we are going. Nephi's turned to face the giant tree, and as though affected by its grandeur, hesitantly shrugged. Do we have a choice? Some time later, they abandoned the remains of the giant sea monster and moved west, planning to check the situation inside the wasteland that between them and the ashen barrow. Initially, they weren't planning to approach the strange island. However, things turned out to be rather unusual once they entered the wasteland. With gray sand under their feet and dead coral walls surrounding them, the group was fully prepared to face unknown danger. Despite the fact that they had not seen any monster moving through this area from the top of the Leviathan's spine, neither Sonny nor Nephi's truly believed that no one was going to attack them in this strange region of the labyrinth. There were too many ways for the nightmare creatures to hide themselves, and if there was one thing the sleepers had learned during their time on the Forgotten Shore, it was that everything here was either deadly or concealing something capable of killing them. In that regard, their first encounter with the carnivorous worms was especially traumatic. However, their common sense turned out to be wrong this time around. Wasteland was quiet and empty, completely void of any signs of life. The absence of monsters was, in theory, supposed to make Sonny feel better, but he felt even more nervous than usual instead. This whole situation reeked of danger. It was strange and unnatural. If even the monsters were afraid to approach this place, what were they doing walking deeper and deeper into the wasteland of their own free will? Were they fools not to turn around and run away immediately? Soon, they reached the point where the walls of the labyrinth had crumbled into dust. Now there was nothing but a vast expanse of gray sand between them and the hill crowned by the giant tree. Nothing could hide on that ashen flat. However, they would also be unable to conceal themselves from anyone's gaze. Sonny glanced at Nephi's. Are you sure you want to do this? Changing Star scowled and lowered her chin. Then, looking forward, she scowled and said, Let's go. Chapter 62, Hide and Seek. As soon as they left the familiar confines of the labyrinth and stepped into the vast expanse of the ashen wasteland, Sonny felt strangely uncomfortable. It was as though he had unknowingly turned slightly agoraphobic while traveling through the complicated madness of the Crimson Maze. He had grown accustomed to being surrounded by tall walls of coral with endless tangled paths stretching in all directions for as far as he could see. Despite the fact that the labyrinth was hiding numerous dangers, it also offered a strange sort of safety. At least in the case of Sonny, who had the advantage of being able to see beyond its twists and turns thanks to his stealthy shadow scout. Now with gray sand beneath and nothing to break the line of sight, he had lost that advantage. The idea of not being able to hide from the enemy made him feel naked. Keep cool. There's no one here. That thought, which was supposed to calm him down, had the opposite effect instead. Indeed, there were no nightmare creatures anywhere in the desolate wasteland, but why was that? What made them so eager to avoid this place? Nephi's was walking in the front of the group, with Sunny right behind her. The Echo was in the rear, moving at a slow pace. He looked around and, after a bit of hesitation, said in a low voice, "I don't like this." Nephi's glanced at him with her usual indifferent expression. Turning away, she simply said, "Stay alert." They continued forward in silence, sand squeaking under their feet. A dozen or so minutes later, Changing Star raised her hand, gesturing them to stop. Turning to Sunny, she asked, "Has your shadow noticed anything?" He shook his head. "No. There are some irregularities here and there, like small knolls or shallow pits, but nothing is moving. Mostly it just seems flat and lifeless." He turned to Cassie and asked hesitantly, "Do you hear anything?" In some cases, her keen hearing was more effective than his shadow sense. When they were caught by the Strom, Cassie had been able to sense that something was wrong long before her seeing companions noticed anything. However, this time it was of no use. She simply shook her head, indicating that there were no unusual sounds around them. Nephi sighed and lowered her head, thinking. Then she cast a gaze at the distant ashen barrow. "Let's continue." However, she did change the direction of the group slightly, aiming to approach one of the knolls that Sunny had noticed. By the time they approached it, it was already noon. The sun was right, above their heads, making their shadows small and shapeless. Sunny's own shadow had returned and was now hiding beneath his feet, looking like a formless blob of darkness. This time of day was its least favorite. Nephi summoned her sword and slowly approached the knoll, trying to determine its nature. There was nothing remarkable about it except for the fact that everything around was flat, and it was not. The knoll was about as tall as Sunny, somewhat oblong and covered in the same gray sand as the rest of the wasteland. It didn't seem dangerous, but there was no harm in checking. Well, most likely, maybe it could provide them with some useful information. Just as Changing Star was about to stretch her hand and touch the surface of the knoll, Sunny's shadow suddenly noticed something moving in the distance, back at the edges of the labyrinth where they had come from. Acting on instinct, Sunny jumped toward the Echo and hissed to Neph, "Hide." At the same time, he dismissed the hulking scavenger. Suddenly losing her, Mount Cassie flung her hands up and fell. Catching her and the princess, Carrie, Sunny darted toward the knoll and lowered himself to the ground, placing the blind girl between himself and crouching Nephi's. Changing Star put one hand on Cassie's shoulder and looked at him with silent question in her eyes. "Danger." Sunny raised one hand with his palm open, telling her to wait. His shadow was already peeking from behind the knoll, carefully observing the source of the movement. Already some distance away, the dead walls of the labyrinth rose from the gray sand. Suddenly, one of them collapsed, knocked over by a massive figure. Surrounded by the cloud of ashen sand, the figure moved forward, stepping onto the flat surface of the wasteland. 8 legs, 2 terrifying bone scythes, black and crimson carapace that looked like ancient armor that had been splattered with blood. Another Centurion, Sunny silently cursed. They fought these monsters twice before and won both times. However, that was because each battlefield had been carefully prepared to stack advantages in their favor, with plenty of planning and devious scheming on their part. He wasn't sure that they would be able to kill one in a direct confrontation, at least not without suffering serious damage. Turning to Nephi's, Sunny whispered. A carapace Centurion had just walked out of the labyrinth. She scowled. Cassie, meanwhile, lightly touched his hand and asked, "Where is it heading?" Sunny blinked, then concentrated on the shadow's vision. Soon he exhaled, with some relief. "Looks like it's heading for the Ashen Barrow. If we stay hidden behind this knoll and it doesn't change course, there's a high chance that it won't notice us." Changing Star thought for a second, and then nodded. "Keep an eye on it and tell me as soon as something changes." Trying to become as small and silent as possible, the 3 of them pressed their bodies to the knoll. There wasn't a lot of space to hide, so they had to endure being cramped against each other. Well, maybe endure was not the right word. Sunny might have even enjoyed the situation in other circumstances. "What are you thinking about, fool? Concentrate on the deadly monster," he thought angrily, berating himself. But it was so hard to concentrate with Cassie's soft body pressed against his deadly monster. Finally able to get his mind out of the gutter, Sunny sighed and focused on observing the Centurion. The hulking creature was moving through the wasteland, slowly drawing. Closer, soon, he was able to see every crimson line and every spike on its weathered carapace. However, his eyes were glued to something else. Cautiously held between the Centurion's scythes, a beautiful crystal was. Gleaming with hypnotic inner light, it was bright and strangely alluring. A transcendent soul shard. They had already seen a similar scene, back when a pair of Centurions were retrieving two of such crystals from the remains of the giant shark-like creature, so that was their destination. Sunny glanced at the magnificent tree standing atop the ashen barrow. With its onyx branches and vibrant scarlet leaves, it looked striking and majestic, like something wholly hidden in the depths of hell. He shared his findings with the group, careful to keep his whisper as quiet as possible. The Centurion was about to walk past their hiding spot. Despite the fact that there was some distance between its path and the knoll, Sunny was still nervous. This was the most dangerous moment. The monster came level with the knoll, then proceeded forward without blinking an eye. He exhaled. It's walking toward the barrow. Nephi's did not relax, still ready for things to go south at any moment. Follow it. Sunny nodded. A moment later, his shadow slid from behind the knoll, sneakily pursuing the nightmare creature. With how much the range of shadow control had improved, he was pretty sure of his ability to tail it to the footsteps of the ashen hill. The Centurion crossed the wasteland with the transcended shard clasped tightly between its scythes. Its bearing was somewhat strange seeming, almost pious. It looked like a pilgrim walking toward a mysterious, sacred site. Soon it approached the ashen barrow and suddenly stopped, as though afraid to cross some invisible line. Then the Centurion carefully placed the shard on the sand and backed away from it, its eyes turned to the ground. After distancing itself from the gleaming crystal, the massive creature kneeled. Sunny had to rub his eyes to make sure that he wasn't seeing things. He wasn't. The carapace Centurion bent its 8 legs and lowered itself to the ground, submissively placing its terrifying sides in front of its bowing torso. Noticing Sunny's strange behavior, Nephi's raised an eyebrow. What is it? He hesitated. Wait. At this moment, his shadow, which was safely hidden some distance away from the kneeling monster, noticed a slight change on the surface of the ashen barrow. The bright glimmer they had seen from the top of the Leviathan's spine was back, only this time it was even more blinding. The glimmer rose into the air from the shadows cast by the branches of the towering tree and moved, slowly approaching the footsteps of the hill. When Sunny was finally able to discern the source of the shining, his eyes widened, feeling a cold shiver running down his spine. He forgot to breathe. Chapter 63. Lord of Ashes. Moving through the ashen sand and piles of fallen leaves, a giant monster was coming down the hill. Sunny gulped, his expression turning dark. The creature was as large as a house with its 8 segmented legs, resembling tall pillars. Its form was similar to that of scavengers and Centurions, comprised of a crab-like carapace and a protruding, somewhat humanoid torso. However, this was where the similarities between them ended. Instead of chitin, the behemoth's shell was seemingly made out of polished, lustrous metal. It was as though its whole body had been once submerged into a crucible of molten steel, emerging from it encased in an impenetrable suit of shining armor. Beams of sunlight were reflecting from the chrome surface of the carapace, creating the bright glimmer Sunny had noticed. Massive but strangely elegant, the steel monster resembled a giant knight. Sunny was ready to swear that he had noticed the shapes of 7 stars carved into its chest. However, that knight was corrupted and evil. It radiated a sinister aura, like a demon summoned from hell to sow death and slaughter. The polished armor of the creature was covered with long, jagged spikes. Its humanoid torso had 4 mighty arms, 2 ending with powerful pincers, the other 2 with razor-sharp, terrifying scythes. The demon's head was more pronounced than that of a scavenger, and crowned with several tall, sharp horns. Its metal face was almost human-like, but simultaneously repulsively monstrous and bestial. Just looking at it made Sunny's skin crawl. That thing is scary. Whatever that creature was, its rank within the Carapace Legion was clearly higher than that of a Centurion, not to mention of a lowly scavenger. It was the next step in their evolution. A general or a commander, perhaps. What were they called? Legates? Praetorians? Holding his breath, Sunny watched as the Carapace demon descended from the ashen barrow, stopping in front of the transcendent soul shard. It looked briefly at the kneeling Centurion. The deadly awakened monster shrank under its gaze, as if terrified of the larger nightmare creature. Sonny knew how it felt since he did the same, when the behemoth's eyes had briefly glided past his shadow's hiding place. Not paying the Centaurian any attention, the carapace demon picked up the gleaming crystal and turned around. Then it unhurriedly returned to the shade of the giant tree's branches. Sonny slowly exhaled. "Sonny, what is happening?" He looked at Cassie, whose face was full of worry and curiosity. After hesitating for a little while, he said, "There's a new threat. Stay quiet a bit longer, I'll explain later." Back at the footsteps of the tall hill, the carapace Centaurian was finally ready to stand up again. Sonny was in a dilemma. He had to follow the monster to make sure that it doesn't stumble on their hiding place on its way back to the labyrinth. However, he was also extremely curious to see what the carapace demon was up to in its lair on the top of the ashen barrow. There was no time to think things through properly. Making a hasty decision, Sonny sent his shadow sliding over the gray sand. It masterfully avoided the carapace Centaurian's eyes and was already climbing the tall hill a few seconds later. "One look, I'll just take one look." Hiding in the deep shade cast by the majestic tree's scarlet crown, the shadow glided up the slope and approached the place where the carapace demon had disappeared from its sight. On top of the hill, the ground was covered with fallen leaves. The ashen barrow was indeed larger than any high natural feature they had encountered before, vast and spacious as an actual island. However, the traces left behind by the massive creature's pillar-like legs could be easily seen. They led the shadow to the center of the island, where the obsidian tree's enormous trunk was rising from the ground, with its broad roots stretching in all directions. The carapace demon was standing beneath the tree, looking up at its lower branches. The transcendent shard was still clenched in its pincer. "What is it looking at?" Sonny made the shadow trace the creature's gaze and noticed several round, appetizing fruits hanging between the scarlet leaves. One of them looked especially ripe. Suddenly, the demon dropped the soul shard into the sand and completely forgetting about it, raised its body. It stretched a pincer up and gently grasped the fruit, then pulled on it. Without any resistance, the fruit tore off the branch, holding it as something fragile and extremely precious. The massive creature slowly lowered itself to the ground. Then it carefully brought the fruit to its mouth and took a small bite. "It's eating fruits. This abomination is vegetarian." Bewildered and not quite sure of what he had just seen, Sonny had no choice but to command his shadow to leave and hurry to the base of the hill. The time was up, and if he wanted to catch up with the carapace Centaurian, he had to act with haste. Gliding over the fallen leaves, the shadow descended from the ashen barrow and flew back in the direction of the labyrinth, soon catching up with the retreating monster. Phew! Feeling a lot of relief, Sonny made sure that the Centaurian's route would not put him on the collision course with the knoll they had been hiding behind, and finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He waited until the scythe-wielding monster was completely gone before slowly rising back to his feet. "It's safe to come out now." Nephi's and Cassie stood up, stretching and massaging their limbs. Suddenly, remembering how tightly they were pressed against each other while hiding behind the knoll, Sonny just barely avoided turning red with embarrassment. That was a necessary measure. He was almost glad that the carapace demon had appeared at the perfect moment to take his thought away from that situation. "What happened?" Nephi's looked at him and raised an eyebrow. For once, her expression of indifference did not look very convincing. Sonny glanced at the not-so-distant ashen barrow and shivered. "There's danger ahead. We need to return to the Bone Ridge. I'll explain. Everything once we're safe and sound, back at the camp." She opened her mouth to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent, simply giving him a nod. The trust they had built was enough for that much at least. Sonny summoned the echo, tied the golden rope around its torso, placed Cassie's makeshift saddle back on its carapace, and helped the blind girl climb to her seat. Picking up the saddlebags, he fixed them back onto the scavenger and took a step away. They were ready to go. Before that, however, Sonny had one more thing to do. Coming close to the knoll, he used his hands to brush the sand off its surface. Soon the onyx-black surface was revealed beneath. It was the same exact color as the bark of the colossal tree growing from the center of the ashen barrow. The knoll was, in fact, just a small portion of one of the tree's giant roots, raised slightly above the ground in this part of the wasteland. Sonny looked around, trying to calculate the size of this sea of ash. Finally, he was starting to understand what had drained all life from the giant patch of the Crimson Labyrinth. Back inside the Bone Ridge, they were sitting around the fire, the delicious Smell of roasting meat filled the air, making Sonny's stomach produce embarrassing sounds. However, it wasn't time to eat yet. He was in the middle of telling the girls about what he had seen. After the Centaurian kneeled, another carapace creature came from the top of the ashen barrow. Only this one was not one of those we had seen before. It was easily twice the size of the Centaurian, 6 or 7 meters tall. I can't even imagine how much it weighs. It looked like a moving house. Nephis frowned, clearly not happy to know that there was such a behemoth barring their way. What's more, its carapace is not made of chitin. Instead, it looks like some strange metal alloy. I don't think we'll be able to cut through it. I also notice any gaps in that monstrosity's armor, not even around the joints. Cassie gulped, turning her head to her friend. Changing Star, however, remained silent. Sonny sighed. In addition, that thing has 4 arms instead of the usual 2, a pair with pincers and a pair with scythes. They're even bigger than the Centaurians. Its carapace is littered with spikes, and it has long horns on its head. It also looks up more human-like. It almost got a face, albeit an extremely ugly one. And its eyes, well, I think that it is more sentient than anything we had faced before. Nephis was thoughtful. After a while, she said, "It is probably an awakened demon. Nightmare creatures with 1 soul core were called beasts. The ones with 2 cores were called monsters. 3 cores belonged to a class of creatures known as demons, with devils right above them with 4 cores." Sonny gave her a nod, indicating that he was in agreement with her conclusion, or maybe a devil. In any case, I think we should avoid that scary bastard at all cost. Changing Star stared at him, tilting her head a little. For a minute or so, there was only silence. Sonny gritted his teeth, then sighed, then blinked a couple of times. Finally, he gave her a doomed, crooked smile. "Let me guess, you want to kill it." Chapter 64, Pursued by Demons. "Let me guess, you want to kill it." Nephis continued to stare at him, with her usual unreadable expression. After a while, Sonny chuckled and shook his head in disbelief. "You really are crazy. That's an awakened demon we're talking about. Remember, have you forgotten that we're just sleepers?" Then he frowned and scratched his head. Wait a second. I feel like we already had this conversation before. Doesn't it feel familiar?" Cassie glanced at the two of them and politely cleared her throat. "Actually, you had said pretty much the exact same thing right before we decided to attack that first carapace Centaurian." Sonny beamed. "Yes, exactly, and how did that end up? I almost got killed." Nephis shrugged indifferently. "You survived, didn't you?" He froze with his mouth open, too flabbergasted by the sheer audacity of her remark to answer immediately. A few seconds later, Sonny was finally able to speak again. "That's not the point." Cassie gently touched her friend on the shoulder and whispered, "Neph, that's not a very nice thing to say." Changing Star's face flushed a little. Glancing aside, she hesitated and said, "What I meant to say is, we've won in the end, didn't we? It was a risk we had to take, and it paid off. We've grown stronger since then." Sonny had a feeling that the fight against the carapace demon was already inevitable, but couldn't bring himself to stop protesting, solely out of principle. "But that thing, it's huge. It's so tall you won't even be able to poke it with your sword. What are we going to do?" asked the bastard politely to lower itself to our level. Neph frowned and looked at him with displeasure. "It's just an awakened demon, I know." Sonny sighed and shook his head again, feeling like he was talking to a stone wall. Changing Star's mind was still a mystery to him. He had realized a long time ago that there was a deep, dark well hidden behind her seemingly radiant exterior. No one pushed themselves that hard, endured that much, went that far unless they were being pursued by demons of their own. He knew that from experience, and judging by how far ahead of everyone he had ever known Nephis was, her personal demons were especially dreadful, much more dreadful than the terrifying carapace demon, at least. But although Sonny understood that she was running from something, he had no idea what destination she was so desperate to reach. Just why was she so hellbent on finding that damned human castle, even more so than Sonny himself? His burning desire to come back to reality and rip all the rewards that the world owed him was so intense that it would frighten most people to death. There were very few things that he wasn't willing to do to achieve his dream. However, it only had meaning for as long as he stayed alive. Nephis, on the other hand, seemed to pursue a goal that held more meaning than her life. Why else would she be so willing to risk it? Sonny just couldn't understand that logic. It was irrational and paradoxical. What can be more important than your life? If you die, you won't be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor. Anyway, he looked Nephi's in the eyes and said, back when we agreed to fight the Carapace Centaurian, we did so because there was no other choice. We were literally stuck on a rock with it. What? About now, don't we have a choice to avoid the Ashen Barrow? She stared at him for a while and then simply said, that's the only way west. Sonny laughed. That is the truth, I'll give you that. When his laughter died down, he wiped the corner of his eye and said, all right, that makes sense. But believe me when I say it, as the only one who actually saw the Carapace demon, we won't be able to defeat it in a fight. Nephi scowled. Your point. Sonny spread his hands. Don't misunderstand. Yes, we can't defeat it. But a dark smile appeared on his face. That doesn't mean that we can't kill it. Changing Star thought about it, then raised an eyebrow and asked, you have a plan? Sonny shook his head. Not yet, not entirely. Let me sleep on it. However, there's one thing I know. For sure. He looked west, remembering the Carapace demon's disturbing, bestial face. In the ensuing silence, Cassie turned her head to face him and asked, with curiosity, what is it? Sonny blinked. Oh yes, it's pretty simple, really. Unlike the scavengers and Centaurians, that thing appears to be rather intelligent, which means that it can be deceived. They spent another uneventful night inside the dead Leviathan's spine. As far as their camps went, this one was probably the safest. There was a certain comfort in being surrounded by walls from all sides, even if they were made out of bone. Sleeping on top of cliffs and coral mounds just meters away from the surface of the dark sea, exposed to elements, was not very restful. Sonny even entertained the thought of suggesting to Nephi's that they should stay here for a while, a few weeks, or even months if needed. They could slowly explore the surrounding areas, hunt monsters, and grow stronger. Then, after absorbing hundreds of soul shards and shadow fragments, armed with dozens of memories, and even a few more echoes, perhaps, they could attack the Carapace demon and be more sure of success. However, he quickly realized that it was a bad idea. The Forgotten Shore was perilous and unpredictable. They were rather successful in conquering its dangers so far, but it was too easy for the situation to change. One moment of bad luck was enough to doom them. One wrong turn, one unfortunate encounter, one more enemy than they were able to handle, and their lives would be over. And that was only in regard to the usual menagerie of abominable horrors they had to fight on the daily basis. The labyrinth hid much more terrifying secrets and existences, not to mention the unimaginable terrors of the deep dark sea. Every additional day they spent here gave a chance for something fatal and unavoidable to happen. Their best hope of survival was to face the Carapace demon as soon as possible. Maybe after defeating it, they would finally be able to see the tall walls of the promised castle. Sonny tossed and turned the whole night thinking about the giant creature and trying to give shape to the nascent seed of the idea of how to kill it. Close to the morning, he was finally able to fall asleep, only to be awakened by Cassie carefully shaking his shoulder half an hour later. Sonny blinked, looking at the blind girl in confusion. What is it? She gestured to Nephi's, asking her to come closer. Then, a little pale, she gathered her courage and said, I had another vision, a vision about the Carapace demon. Chapter 65. Lights in the darkness. Sonny was instantly wide awake. Sitting up, he hurriedly rubbed his eyes, and then glanced at the blind girl, ready to listen. Nephi's approached them and sat down, her face barely visible in the dim light of the early dawn. Past or future? Sonny blinked. Right, I should have asked myself. Cassie thought for a bit and then hesitantly answered, Past, I think. After a short pause, her expression changed to that of certainty. No, I'm sure of it. Changing Star slightly tilted her head. That's good, so what did you see? Cassie deeply inhaled and fell silent for several seconds, remembering. Her face paled a little, but this time she was ready to face her fear. I saw the Ashen Barrow deep at night, enveloped in a raging storm. Winds were bending the branches of the great tree, as if desperate to break them. The island was illuminated by the constant barrage of thundering lightning bolts, with rain falling from the skies like a flood. She paused, catching her breath, and continued. The Carapace demon was there, standing in the middle of the storm like an unshakable fortress made of polished steel. Arcs of electricity were dancing between the spikes on his armor, but the demon did not pay it any attention. He was just as Sonny described, prideful, sinister, and terrifying. Cassie closed her eyes. When I looked into his eyes, I felt a sense of emptiness and corruption. he observed the storm until it began to dissipate. The winds weakened, the rain stopped. The great tree stood unbroken, just as magnificent as it was before, but then the last bolt of lightning fell from the sky and struck the ground beside it. Sunny was listening to her tale with great attention, hopeful to hear a piece of useful information. So that monstrosity is not afraid of lightning. Shame with its metal carapace. I was almost tempted to try and lure it from under the tree during a storm. Apparently that wouldn't work. Meanwhile, Cassie was ready to carry on. That bolt of lightning could never hurt the carapace demon, let alone the miraculous tree. However, when it hit the ground, it ignited the fallen leaves that cover the ashen barrow's surface. Soon, a large part of the island was engulfed in fire. In the absolute darkness of the night, it shone like a beacon. Sunny perked up, remembering something, back when the three of them first met at the beginning of their deadly adventure through the dream realm. The girls mentioned that the light he had seen from the giant knights statue a few nights prior was indeed made by them. However, making that fire had turned out to be a big mistake. At night, any source of light was like a lure for the monsters of the Forgotten Shore, including the terrifying creatures that lurked in the depths of the dark sea. That's why, ever since, they were careful to never light a fire after sunset, preferring to endure the darkness instead of attracting unknown horrors from beneath the waves. Having a guess of what had happened next in Cassie's vision, he waited for the blind girl to continue. Her voice trembled a little. Before the flames died down, the dark sea surged, and a thing crawled out of it, covering almost the entire slope of the ashen barrow with its body. It looked like a mass of bones and rotten flesh connected by black seaweed, with thousands of horrible eyes staring at me hungrily from beneath, coiling tentacles seething as it pushed itself toward the great tree. Her face turned slightly green. Just remembering the abomination made Cassie feel nauseated, but she gritted her teeth and did not stop speaking. That was the most repulsive creature I've ever seen. However, it seemed slow and clumsy, as though being ashore, outside of the black water, was weakening it. The carapace demon did not hesitate to lunge at the creature, completely ignoring the fact that it was at least 10 times his size. It was like he completely lost his mind, enraged by the intrusion on the island. Nephi suddenly spoke. How did the demon survive? The blind girl hesitated. I don't know. I didn't see the battle itself, only its beginning and its end. At the break of dawn, the carapace demon crawled back into the shade of the great T. He was severely wounded, with several of his legs missing, and his sides covered by a spiderweb of cracks. The fire was gone, and there was no sign of the sea creature anywhere in sight. She paused for a moment and then said in a quiet voice, "The most terrible wound was on his chest. The steel armor of the demon was fractured and split apart, revealing the beating heart inside. Rivers of azure blood were flowing from the wound, mixing with the ashen sand. The demon crawled to the base of the tree and laid his broken body between its roots." Cassie sighed. "The last thing I saw was the passage of time. I don't know how long it took, but eventually, the carapace demon was able to recover from his wounds. His scythes restored themselves, his legs grew back. The fracture on his chest was the last to heal. However, it wasn't healed completely. Hidden from sight, there's still a weakness in his armor." Both Sunny and Nephi's were silent for a long time, thinking. Changing Star was the first to break the silence. "So it's not impenetrable after all." Then she looked at Sunny and asked, "How's your plan coming along?" He blinked, extricating himself from the swarm of thoughts. Glancing at his companion, Sunny smiled. "Pretty well. I already had an inkling of how we should proceed, but Cassie's vision gave me additional inspiration." Nephi's raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" He gave her a confident nod. "Yeah. It's a wild idea, but it might just work." "Well, maybe. In any case, it's going to be risky, and we'll have to make some preparations." Both Cassie and Nephi's looked at him expectantly. The blind girl cautiously asked, "So, what's your plan? How are we going to deceive the demon?" Sunny crossed his arms. "It's not very complicated. Actually, I got the idea from that ancient fellow Neph likes to talk about. We're going to build." He took a dramatic pause and then said with a mysterious smile, "A Trojan ass." However, their reaction was not what he had expected. Both girls blinked, then stared at him with complicated expressions. Well, Cassie did not stare, since she was blind, but her face was exactly the same as Changing Star's. Strange. What now?" Sunny scratched the back of his head, somewhat embarrassed, and cleared his throat. Did I use the wrong word? I thought that Odysseus guy built a wooden animal, a donkey. Nephi's raised a hand and put it on her forehead, closing her eyes. Weird, does she have a headache? Are you all right? She sighed deeply, then said in a flat tone, a horse. It was a horse. The next day, they returned to the place of the battle between the Carapace Legion and the centipede monsters. A few days earlier, they had lured a Carapace Centurion here to ambush it, but ended up causing a massive confrontation between the two tribes of nightmare creatures. The carcasses of some of the monsters were still there, buried slightly in the mud. Of course, there was no meat left on their skeletons. The inhabitants of the labyrinth were for the most part carrion eaters, after all. However, the three sleepers were not interested in meat. They came for something else, stopping in front of the Centurion's empty shell, cleaned of any flesh by some unknown beasts. He looked at the black and crimson carapace in satisfaction. Nephi's walked over and stood by his side, an unreadable expression on her face. Is this what you wanted? Sunny smiled. Yeah, exactly. I knew that nothing would be insane enough to chew on the chitin, but in this place, you never know. I wasn't sure about its condition, but the condition was good. In fact, it was perfect. Chapter 66, first part of the plan. Close to the evening, with the sun tiredly descending toward the horizon, a strange creature walked out of the colorless remains of the labyrinth. If walking was even the right word. Dragging its legs in the sand, the creature somehow floated forward without moving them. It looked like a Carapace Centurion, or at least a close approximation of one. All the necessary parts were in place. The creature had a black carapace, with a menacing crimson pattern on it, a humanoid torso, 8 segmented legs and 2 arms ending with formidable bone scythes. However, all these parts looked mismatched and strange, as though put together by some clumsy sculptor. Additionally, the Centurion moved as if it was seriously drunk. The carapace was careening to one side, sometimes scraping against the sand. The torso was swinging back and forth for no apparent reason. The sides were awkwardly lodged behind the creature's back, crossed against each other at a strange angle. At some point, one of them simply dropped to the ground. The Centurion stopped and hesitated for a few seconds, as though unsure what to do. Then, it left its scythe arm behind and continued on its way as if nothing had happened. A perceptive observer would have noticed that the creature seemed to possess 2 shadows. The first shadow was as one would expect, its shape identical to the creature itself. The second one resembled a human. It briefly showed itself from beneath the larger shadow when the Centurion abandoned the runaway limb. The human shadow then proceeded to facepalm and shake its head in utter contempt. The whole situation was nothing short of being completely bizarre. But for better or worse, there was nobody around to notice the weird creature. Unobstructed, it traversed the wasteland, moving in the direction of the Ashen Barrow. Soon it was almost at the footstep of the tall hill. The sunset was approaching. The strange Centurion plopped on the ground at the base of the Ashen Barrow and stopped moving completely. Awkward and lopsided it looked, like a parody of the other monster of its kind, who had kneeled gracefully at the same spot a few days prior. Additionally, it arrived without a tribute. There was no transcendent soul shard in sight. Added to the disrespectful pose, this transgression was more than enough to get the Centurion killed. Perhaps it was suicidal. On top of the barrow, the carapace demon moved and rose from the ashen sand. His shining armor glistened, reflecting the light of the setting sun. Encased in bright metal with a crown of horns adorning his head, the demon looked fearsome and sinister. Gazing down, he lingered for a few moments. 2 dark scarlet embers ignited in the depths of the demon's eyes. Shifting his terrifying sides, the giant monster walked forward, slowly descending from the hill to face the strange visitor. The ground shook as he approached. However, the bizarre Centurion did not even flinch. In fact, it remained completely motionless. The carapace demon stopped some distance away from the suspicious creature. He observed it, clearly understanding that its pathetic appearance might be a trap. The labyrinth was full of unimaginable dangers. Rashly approaching an unknown foe was not something an awakened demon, who possessed his own form of intelligence, would do. At least that was what the 3 sleepers had assumed. However, they were wrong. Just a second later, the carapace demon lunged forward. Its scythe flashed through the air, severing the Centurion's torso in half. The adamantine chitin was cut apart as though it was made of butter. The upper half of the monster's torso flew off, revealing only emptiness inside. On the other side of the Ashen Barrow, Sunny, who was running up the Slope, with all his might, cursed under his breath. That was too soon. He thought that they would have more time. Who knew that the carapace demon would turn out to be such a daredevil? He didn't even hesitate. Before going all out, with Cassie riding piggyback on his back, Sonny gritted his teeth and tried to run even faster. It was time to switch to Plan B. A moment later, the weird Centurion's carapace came apart, setting the Echo that had been hiding underneath it free, pushing the pieces of chitin away. With its powerful pincers, the scavenger rushed toward the towering demon. It was aiming to duck underneath it and hopefully mess up the giant's legs. The first part of Sonny's plan was rather simple. They were going to use the remains of a dead carapace Centurion to disguise the Echo, which was much smaller in comparison, as one of the officers of the Carapace Legion. Then they would send it to the base of the Ashen Barrow to lure the demon away. The three of them were going to circle the hill and hide themselves under the gray sand in advance, then run up the slope and to the center of the island as soon as the demon had left. The Echo was supposed to buy them enough time to climb the great tree and conceal themselves in its branches. Then Sonny would dismiss the Echo, thus finishing the first stage of the plan. He never intended for the scavenger to actually fight the fearsome demon. However, the carapace demon's unusually swift act of aggression had messed up the timing of the whole thing. The decoy was already destroyed, yet they weren't even halfway to the tree. In this situation, there was no choice but to order the Echo to attack, hoping that it could stall the giant monster. That way, of course, Sonny was putting his scavenger at risk, but there was no other choice. Just as he was about to reach the crest of the hill, the Echo tried to hide itself beneath the carapace demon's massive body. It was doing the same thing that Nephis had done when fighting the first carapace Centurion, intending to use the size of the enemy against it. The difference was that this time, the smaller participant of the fight was clad in a sturdy carapace, as opposed to a squishy human girl who had no protection. Even if the demon tried to crush the scavenger with its weight, it wouldn't be able to kill it. However, the demon understood it too. Moving with incredible speed, he shifted his torso and struck out with a pincer. The scavenger was swatted away like an irritating insect, flying through the air and heavily crashing onto the ground. Its carapace had almost cracked. Running toward the great tree, Sonny grimaced. He wanted to dismiss the Echo, but knew that it was too soon. They needed more time. Ahead of him, Nephis was already approaching the enormous black trunk. Not wasting any time, she removed the seaweed rucksack from her back, gently laid it on the ground, and began climbing, grabbing onto the cracks of the onyx bark. Meanwhile, the Echo was shakily rising to its legs. A stubborn light was burning in its eyes. Producing a loud screech, it clacked its pincers in the air, and once again rushed toward the demon. "Go get him, buddy," Sonny screamed inwardly, wishing his scavenger luck. With all his heart, the smaller creature bravely ran toward the steel behemoth, raising its pincers to attack. It was followed by two shadows, one bestial, the other one human. Sonny was quickly shortening the distance to the great tree. Below the hill, the carapace demon calmly stepped toward the rushing enemy. Its four arms moved in unison. Suddenly, the scavenger's arms were sliced off. Its body was gripped in two giant pincers and raised into the air. Sonny didn't even have time to react. A fraction of a second later, the demon slightly strained its arms and tore the Echo in two, separating its torso from the carapace and crushing both halves into a bloody pulp. On top of the hill, Sonny stumbled. The familiar voice resounded like a tolling bell in his ears. "Your Echo has been destroyed." Chapter 67, Racing Against Time. "Your Echo has been destroyed." Sonny stumbled and almost fell. Cassie gripped his shoulders tightly and leaned back a little, trying to help him keep balance. With fallen leaves flying from under his feet, Sonny somehow managed to catch himself. Time. No. Anger and regret clouded his mind, but it was too late to do anything. His trusty scavenger was dead, sliced and torn apart by the giant creature. The ease and brutality with which the carapace demon had decimated the poor brave beast would have been insulting. If it wasn't so terrifying, it only took him a split second. The Echo was gone. Not only had Sonny seen its tragic end through the eyes of his shadow, he also felt the subtle connection between them disappear. In his soul sea, one of the spheres of light shimmered and vanished, leaving the silent surface of the water a little bit darker. He had lost his most valuable possession. But the bitterness Sonny felt was not only because of how useful the Echo had been or how much money it could have brought him in the real world. He had actually grown to like the mindless scavenger quite a bit. It was big, loyal and reliable. It even seemed to possess a strange sort of stubborn, off-putting personality. And now it was dead. Gritting his teeth, Sonny ran like a madman. There would be time to mourn. The loss of the loyal Echo later. Right now they had bigger problems. "Sonny, what happened?" Cassie's whisper sounded worried and tense. She must have felt the chain in his mood through his posture and body language. To be completely honest, Sonny was in no shape to talk, running up the hill, at top speed with the blind girl on his back, no matter how delicate and light she was, had been a tall task for him without the support of the shadow. He was struggling to breathe, and there was still a considerable distance to the great tree. However, Sonny had to answer, his voice hoarse and rugged. He killed the Echo. Then there was no time for words anymore, because things were turning from bad to worse. Down at the bottom of the hill, the carapace demon was standing above the mutilated remains of the scavenger, looking at them with contempt. Heavy drops of azure blood were falling from each of his 4 upper limbs. Suddenly, the corpse of the Echo began to shine with soft light. Then it shimmered and dissolved into a river of tiny sparks, which then fell to the ground and disappeared, leaving no trace of the hulking scavenger behind. Even its blood on the demon's scythes and pincers was gone. After all, the Echo was just a manifestation of a slain nightmare creature, and not the real thing. It came from nothing and was now returned to the state of nothingness. However, the carapace demon was not looking at the unexpected light. Instead, he was staring at one particular spot on the ground. There, a lonely human shadow was frozen in confusion, uncertain what to do with the body of the Echo, and consequently its spacious shadow. Gone, it was instantly revealed and had nowhere else to hide. Crap! The demon tilted his head, then moved with the speed of lightning and pierced the shadow with a scythe. Sonny flinched, ready to experience blinding pain. But nothing happened. The shadow, which had raised its hands in fright, looked down at the massive blade protruding from its chest and scratched its head. It was completely fine. Well, of course, it was just a shadow after all. One had to have a body to be susceptible to such attacks. Right, what else did I think would happen? Meanwhile, the demon was staring at the nonchalant shadow. The menacing, scarlet light in his eyes blazed brighter. Sonny was getting closer to the trunk of the tree, temporarily fueled by adrenaline. Otherwise, he might have fainted from the strain already. Just a little more. They had every chance of making it. The shadow just had to distract the giant monster for a bit. But it seemed as though luck was not on his side today. Down below, the carapace demon retrieved his scythe. However, instead of attacking the human shadow again, it suddenly turned around and cast a dark look at the top of the ashen barrow, where the giant tree stood in all its magnificent beauty. The bastard was smart after all. Curse it all. Forgetting about the shadow, the behemoth lunged forward, rushing back up the tall hill's slope. It moved with frightening speed, covering a dozen meters with each second. "Get back here," Sonny screamed to his shadow as he approached the trunk of the tree. Helping Cassie climb down from his back, Sonny picked up the rucksack that Nephis had left behind and handed it to the blind girl. "Be gentle with that." Cassie nodded, well aware of the contents of the rucksack, and carefully hung it on her shoulder. At that time, Changing Star had already reached the lowest branches of the great tree. Not wasting any time, she moved to a spot above her. Companions summoned the golden rope and threw one of its ends down. Catching the rope, Sonny quickly tied a loop and handed it to Cassie. "You go up first." The blind girl hesitated for a moment, then accepted it. Just as she was about to put her foot inside the loop, Sonny suddenly stopped her. "Wait. Summon your staff." The wooden staff that Cassie used to walk was actually a magical item, capable of summoning strong winds. In their travels, they rarely had a cause to use it, but now it could come in handy. Surprised and unsure of the reason, she nevertheless did as he had asked. Summoning the memory from her sea of soul, the wooden staff appeared. In her hand, Sonny lightly hugged the blind girl from behind and turned her body, guiding the hand holding the staff in the necessary direction. Then he said, "Now summon the wind." In the next moment, a strong gale rose around them, blasting fallen leaves and ashen sand into the air. Instantly, a large portion of the island's surface was stripped bare. More sand was revealed beneath. Meanwhile, the shadow was racing against the carapace demon. The massive creature was already halfway up the hill, moving with the speed of a rushing train. The nimble shadow, however, was even faster. It had already overtaken the behemoth and was now flying forward, hurrying to return to its master. "Good, now go." Sunny helped Cassie put her foot into the loop and stepped back, watching. As Nephi's pulled the rope up, she was going as fast as she could, which was really fast by human standards, but was it fast enough? Sweating, he counted seconds and waited. His life now depended on whether or not the rope would return before the demon arrives. Every moment felt like an eternity. He could already hear the distant but quickly approaching sound of the carapace demon's 8 towering legs stomping furiously through the sand. Finally, Cassie was at the level of the giant tree's lower branches. Nephi's helped her step out of the loop and settle on the wide surface of the branch, then threw the rope down again. The demon was approaching the tree, still hidden from sight by its massive trunk. The shadow slipped beneath Sunny's feet and wrapped itself around his body. Catching the rope, Sunny practically flew up, climbing with incredible, adrenaline-fueled speed. Landing on the branch beside the girls, he quickly turned around and tried to pull the rope up. The monster could not notice the golden shine of it, otherwise it all would have been for nothing. But there was less than a second left. Oh no, Sunny thought, his heart skipping a beat. But then Nephi's simply dismissed the memory, making the golden rope disappear into thin air. The three of them crouched, hiding from sight, and held their breaths. A moment later, the furious mass of spikes and polished metal appeared. Beneath them, the carapace demon abruptly stopped, gazing around with his burning scarlet eyes. His pincers clicked as if thirsty to tear flesh apart. The terrifying scythes were raised into the air, ready to slash and sever. But there was nothing to kill underneath the great tree. The demon lingered, looking right and left. Then he raised his head and looked up. Thankfully, the branch the three sleepers were hiding on was very wide, more than enough to hide them from his sight. They remained motionless and silent, afraid to produce even the smallest of sounds. After a while, the behemoth finally lowered his gaze and carefully observed the ground, looking for the traces of possible intruders. However, the ground was clean and bare, all signs of their passage erased by Sunny with the help of Cassie's staff in advance. Not finding anything, the carapace demon had no choice but to walk away, moving on to explore other parts of the island. Sunny was finally able to exhale. Some distance away, the demon reached the edges of the area affected by the magical gale. There he finally found 2 sets of footprints, one left behind by Nephi's, the other one by Sunny. With an angry roar that sounded like the clamor of tearing metal, the giant creature rushed down the slope of the ashen barrow, following the footprints to the wasteland beneath. However, the gray desert was desolate and empty, with no living creature in sight. It was colored crimson by the setting sun. At that moment, the ground shook slightly, and a thunderous rumble resounded throughout the labyrinth, bringing with it chilling wind and the smell of salt. The dark sea was returning. Throwing one last hateful gaze toward the wasteland, the carapace demon turned around and slowly headed back to the top of his barrow. Chapter 68. Beacon of Death. Sunny, Nephi's, and Cassie sat on a branch of the great tree, waiting for the sun to set. The branch was wide enough to accommodate twice as many people, so they weren't worried about being spotted from the ground. Still, they remained silent and motionless, wary of the giant monster that sometimes appeared beneath their hiding place. The sound of his footsteps sent shivers through the tense bodies of the three sleepers. Not once since coming to the Forgotten Shore had Sunny hoped for the night to come faster, but there was a first time for everything. They could only proceed with the next step of the plan after darkness had fallen, so there was nothing to do now but wait. Sitting with his back against Neph and Cassie, Sunny stared into the distance and tried not to think about anything. Obsessing over past mistakes and future risks was only going to dampen his resolve, and it was already in short supply. Meeting a setback so early into the plan really threw Sunny off his game. He still couldn't recover from the sudden loss of the precious echo. Of course, he knew beforehand that many things could go wrong. In fact, he had even warned the girls that there were too many unpredictable elements, and thus it was impossible to reliably predict their chances of success. Nevertheless, he had not expected to lose the strongest member of their group at the very beginning. The first stage of the plan was supposed to be the safest. Things to come were going to be much more dangerous. Sunny looked at the darkening skies, barely visible through the thick canopy of the great tree's crown, and listened to the noise of the rising sea. In the dim twilight, Cassie shifted a little and then gently squeezed his hand. Her warm touch made Sunny tense up, but then, realizing that the blind girl was just trying to console him, he allowed himself to relax. Stupid, what am I, a kid? Holding hands will not solve anything. But despite these grumbling thoughts, Sunny reluctantly realized that he did feel a bit reassured, with no logical reason at all. Maybe they were going to pull this off after all. If this was their will, who dared to stop them? Soon, the night descended, drowning the world in absolute darkness. The Ashen Barrow had become an island in the black, undulating void of the dark sea. The brakes of the great tree swayed gently in the darkness, their vibrant scarlet leaves now indistinguishable from the obsidian surface. Of the wood, the leaves whispered and rustled, creating a calming melody. In the threatening murmur of the surging waves, Sunny sighed, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. He was sure of his plan, as far as it was possible to be sure of anything in this cursed place, but he also knew all the risks and all the things that could go wrong. At the end of it all, they were still tossing a coin, hoping that its fall was not going to spell their doom. He felt Neff's position shift. She turned her head and glanced in his direction, a calm expression on her face. Today, her inexplicable ability to remain composed in any situation, no matter how dire, was especially frustrating, even though Changing Star could not see anything in the pitch black darkness of the starless void. She knew that he would notice her questioning look. Sunny closed his eyes, then opened them again and slowly exhaled. Let's begin. The three of them moved, performing a rehearsed set of motions. Cassie carefully shifted to the side, giving Sunny and Nephi space to do what needed to be done. Sunny gently placed the seaweed rucksack between himself and Neff, then opened it. His motions were slow and cautious. Inside the rucksack, two large clay containers lay surrounded by several layers of soft seaweed fiber. These jars were made by Sunny himself, and as such were not particularly sturdy. After all, he wasn't a craftsman. All his knowledge about pottery was received in a single day of listening to Teacher Julius's rants about the importance of clay in the development of human civilization. Still, he at least remembered the basics. Inside the jars, all the oil they had gathered from the centipede monsters splashed around, making Sunny's heart beat unsteady. A centipede monster had two sacs in its body, each containing a different oily substance. When mixed, these substances produced an incredibly corrosive, deadly oil that could eat through a scavenger's carapace in seconds. It was also highly flammable. The jars contained the two components of the centipede oil. If they were to break during their run to the great tree, allowing the components to mix, well, there was a reason why the rucksack was entrusted to Nephi's while Sunny carried Cassie despite his inferior physical endurance. The centipede oil was the centerpiece of his plan. Placing the clay jars on the branch, Sunny took out one last thing from the rucksack. It was a makeshift torch made out of bone, and more seaweed. Traditionally, torches were supposed to be made out of wood, but on the Forbidden Shore, bones were much more easily found than sticks. In the darkness, he found Neff's cool hand, took it into his own, and then placed the torch on her open palm. At that moment, Sunny couldn't help but remember the other times Changing Star's hands had touched his body. The first time was when he was dying, his chest crushed by the Carapace Centurion's bone scythe. The other time was on the day he handed her the Starlight Legion armor and learned about her cruel flaw. Both days were very memorable, although for different reasons. He had a feeling that this day was also going to be forever etched in his memory, provided they lived to see the morning. Sunny deeply inhaled. I'm ready. Nephi's nodded, and then rose to her feet. Standing tall, she grasped the torch and closed her eyes as though praying. Clad in white armor with her silver hair dancing in the wind, she looked like a beautiful, solemn angel. Then, white radiance ignited beneath her eyelids. In the next moment, bright fire burst from beneath her hands, igniting the top of the torch. Changing Star opened her eyes, extinguishing the light shining in them, and raised the torch high above her head. In the lightless world, this single small flame looked like a lonely star, drowning in the sea of darkness. Simultaneously, Sunny stepped to the edge of the branch, inhaled deeply, and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Hey, asshole, come get me if you dare." Then all hell broke loose. Attracted by the sudden burst of light and Sunny's belligerent cries, the Carapace demon appeared out of nowhere in a storm of fury. Its towering legs tore through the ashen sand, throwing clouds of it into the air. Two scarlet eyes immediately focused on the shouting human, sending a nervous shiver through Sunny's legs. "Yeah, right here, you pile of scrap. Come and get it, fat lobster. This is my island now," he shouted, pretending to not be scared out of his wits. The demon dashed toward him. This behemoth was as tall as a house, but still not tall enough to reach the branches of the great tree with his scythes. So for the moment, Sunny was still safe. He was pretty sure that this won't be the case for long, but it was enough. Time to bring the plan to fruition, if he doesn't miss. Just as the carapace demon was about to appear right beneath the branch. Sunny was standing on. He took a deep breath, aimed, and tossed both of the jars down. The creature reacted with lightning speed, slicing both jars into pieces with his horrible scythes. However, it was of no use. The oily liquids contained inside still rained on its carapace in a torrent, followed by a scattering of clay shards. If anything, it only made the surface of the impact larger, covering most of the demon's metal carapace in a layer of liquid. The two components mixed, producing the deadly corrosive oil, which then burned into the lustrous armor. Sunny held his breath. However, the centipede monster's oil, which was capable of destroying the unbreakable chitin of both scavengers and centurions, turned out to be completely ineffective against the strange alloy covering the carapace. Demon's body. It didn't even leave a scratch on it. Sunny's face darkened. That's Nephi silently appeared by his side, raising an arm. Just as I expected. Luckily, Sunny did not put a lot of value on the oil's corrosive qualities. To begin with, he needed the oil for its other quality, its flammability. Guided by the loud sounds produced by the massive monster, Nephi's moved and threw the torch down with a powerful swing of her arm. Spinning, the torch streaked through the air like a meteor and landed right in the middle of the demon's carapace. In the next second, the giant creature was engulfed in flames. Sunny did not really expect the fire to be able to damage the demon. He was sure that the behemoth could withstand much more than just simple heat, but now, covered in the burning oil, the carapace demon shined brightly in the pitch-black night of the forgotten shore. He had turned into a fiery beacon, calling all the monsters of the cursed dark sea to come crawling from its black depths. Chapter 69, The Guest Shadow Slave. The giant demon was engulfed in flames, shining like a bright beacon in the hungry darkness of the night. His polished armor blazed with reflected light, sending radiant glints in all directions. Drops of burning oil were falling to the ground, flaring up as they hit the ashen sand. For a second, it seemed as though time had stopped. Sunny was staring at the incandescent glow of the fire, his eyes wide, almost failing to believe that they had actually pulled this insanity off. Nephi's was frozen by his side, her hand still outstretched after the throw. But they really did, they pulled it off. Sunny never seriously considered facing the carapace demon in an honest battle, if a battle between a giant death machine and three powerless humans could even be called honest. However, their lacking strength did not mean that they could not murder the evil creature. They just had to be smart about how to do it. For example, they could find something stronger to do the dirty work for them. That's why he had concocted a plan to sneak onto the ashen barrow, wait for the night to come, lit the behemoth aflame, and watch it be torn apart by the terrifying monsters of the dark sea. And now they were halfway to making that plan a reality. Of course, the most dangerous part was yet to come. They still had to survive the attack of the creatures of the black water themselves. And before that, the carapace demon roared with fury, making Sunny feel like his ears were going to bleed. The roar sounded like a deafening cacophony of rusted metal being torn apart by giant claws. Two scarlet eyes shone through the conflagration of flames, piercing the young man with a concentrated beam of murderous hatred. Before that, they had to last until the sea monsters arrive. The infuriated demon was out for their blood, and no one knew how much time it would take for the dark sea creatures to appear on the ashen barrow. Sunny was scared that the demon was capable of performing ranged attacks. If not, he might be able to climb the tree to get to them, or try to kill them in a way that they had not even considered. In the worst-case scenario, they would have to endure his rage for quite a while. Looking into the giant's hateful eyes, he sensed that the creature was thinking in the same direction. When the demon glanced in the direction of the great tree's obsidian trunk, Sunny's heart suddenly skipped a bit. However, in the end, cold rationality won over seething rage in the carapace demon's mind. Instead of wasting time trying to get to the three tiny humans, he suddenly rolled on the ground, hoping to use the sand to douse the flames dancing on his carapace. The whole island shook, almost throwing Sunny off the branch. Crap. Why did the bastard have to be so smart? For a moment, Sunny entertained the idea that the demon was actually going to succeed in extinguishing the fire before the dwellers of the depths had noticed it. But he didn't have to worry. Suddenly, Nephi's turned to face the dark surface of the sea. Her face paled slightly. Sunny was a second late to react, but almost instantly he too felt a strange change in the world around them. It was hard to describe with words. The rustle of the scarlet leaves suddenly felt quieter, the sound of the waves crashing against the shores of the Ashen Island louder. It was as though some invisible pressure descended on the world, making everything feel slightly different. Then the air became colder, and a wall of thick fog appeared above the dark waters. The carapace demon had also noticed this change. He stopped trying to douse the flames and rose from the sand, the oil still burning on his carapace. Not paying it any attention anymore, the demon turned to the sea, a sense of grim resignation radiating from his posture. Then it was replaced by dark resolve and frenzied bloodlust. The fog slowly moved, crawling onto the island. Sonny felt shivers run down his spine, realizing that it was flowing against the wind. The sound of waves was now muffled and changed, almost imperceptibly so. And there in the fog something was moving. He could almost make out a figure. It was. Suddenly Cassie's small palm covered his eyes, with her voice trembling. With tension she whispered, "Don't look. No matter what happens, don't open your eyes." Sonny froze, obediently shutting his eyes. A cold sense of fright wrapped itself around his heart. He had never heard the blind girl's voice sound like this before, not even when she was recalling her terrifying visions. Cassie slowly removed her hand. Blinded, he could only rely on his hearing. At least that was what he thought until the cold fog touched his skin. Then, in the muffled silence, he heard Cassie's voice again. Only this time it was distorted and coming from the wrong direction. "Don't look, don't look, don't look." Sonny gulped, feeling his hair stand on end. The sound of the blind girl's distorted voice echoed in the fog, surrounding him from all sides. Instead of growing quieter, it was becoming louder, overlapping over itself. "Don't look, don't look, don't look, don't look." Then it grew even louder still, and turned into a cacophony of screams, crashing into Sonny like a wave, sounding nothing like what human vocal chords could ever produce. "Don't look, don't look, don't look, don't." Sonny stood paralyzed, stunned by the onslaught of inhuman shrieks. All he could do was try not to fall to his knees. And then, when his resilience was almost broken, everything suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence enveloped the world, making him exhale with relief. It was over. A few seconds later, Cassie whispered into his ear, "Open your eyes." After hearing the clear sound of her voice, Sonny was about to do as she told. Then he stopped. Her voice did not sound terrifying and distorted. It was just as usual, sweet and melodic. It even came from the right direction, but something about it was wrong. What? He lingered, keeping his eyes closed. Why was it so calm? Why didn't he feel the warmth of her breath as she leaned close to whisper into his ear? And how could she lean if he was taller? Sonny froze, afraid to even breathe. Cassie's clear, familiar voice repeated, "Open your eyes, open." Then, mere centimeters away, it exploded with cold, malevolent authority. "Open your eyes." But he didn't. A second passed, then another, then one more. Each of them felt like an eternity. Sonny trembled, practically feeling his body aging. Finally, the voice returned, but this time it felt as though it was further away. Withdrawing, no matter. Soon, he was able to hear the rustling of leaves and the sound of waves. Again, he could also hear Cassie and Neff breathing ruggedly beside him. It seemed that they were also assaulted by the terrifying mimic. And also, somewhere beneath them, the carapace demon roared and hit his scythes against each other. The loud clamor of steel resounded beneath the great tree, sending an almost palpable wave in all directions. This wave seemed to expel the unnatural fog, creating an enormous sphere of clean air. Sonny still kept his eyes shut. In the next moment, the whole island trembled as the demon clashed with the unknown horror that had been hiding in the fog. Something shattered with a deafening thunder, and the ground shook again, causing the branches of the great tree to sway. With his hands trembling, Sonny outstretched them and grabbed onto his companions, drawing them close. Holding each other, they listened to the sounds of the furious battle and waited. An eternity later, the fight between the carapace demon and the guest from the depths was over. Silence had returned to the Ashen Barrow once again. Sonny had long ago lost the track of time and grew desensitized to the tremors running through the great tree each time the two monsters clashed. Sudden stillness gave him a start. With a slight shudder, he turned his head and listened, trying to discern what was happening. In the quiet aftermath of the terrible battle, Nephi's hesitated and then said in a raspy voice, "We can open our eyes now." Sonny lingered before following her advice. He opened his eyes and blinked a couple of times, his vision slowly returning. The pale light of dawn was creeping from the east, enveloping the island in the dim twilight. Beneath them, the surface of the island was torn apart and upturned, almost unrecognizable. It was as though the Ashen Barrow was pummeled by several rounds of heavy artillery fire. And on that surface, damn it, the carapace demon was slowly limping back from the edges of the island, leaving a trail of azure blood behind. He was heavily wounded and in a terrible shape, with several limbs missing and a spiderweb of cracks covering his once pristine carapace. Two of his arms were gone, leaving him with a single scythe and a single pincer. Most of his rear legs were either broken or severed, forcing the behemoth to walk in a strange, unsteady gait. However, he was still alive. More than that, none of the armor plates covering his vital organs were seriously damaged, his metal shell still strong and impenetrable. Sonny clenched his fists and glanced at Neff, a dark expression on his face. What do we do?" Changing Star looked down. There was a cold glint in her calm, gray eyes. Stretching her arm to the side, she summoned her sword and said, "Finish him off." Chapter 70, Judgment of the Blade. Sonny looked at the wounded demon, a grim look of resolve on his face. At this point, there was no reason to argue. They had no other choice but to face the guardian of the island themselves. Sonny's bag of tricks was all empty anyway. In the end, their fates were still going to be decided by sharp blades. Someone was going to get killed, and someone was going to be the killer. How are we going to deal with his armor? Nephise weighed the sword in her hand and glanced down. I will break through the armor. Can you create an opening? Sonny nodded, not wasting time on unnecessary questions. If Changing Star was certain of her ability to cut through the demon's carapace, he had no reason to doubt it, creating an opening that was not going to be easy. Even though the monster had suffered terrible injuries, he was still a force to be reckoned with. His size alone was going to pose difficulties. They would have to bring the behemoth down to his knees before even thinking of carrying out any sort of an effective attack. And he was not just going to stand still under their assault either. But what else was there to do? While Nephise was tying the golden rope to the branch, Sonny walked over to Cassie and lightly squeezed her shoulder. She tried to force a smile. I take it that the carapace demon is still alive. Despite the heavy, cold, dark feeling gripping his heart, Sonny tried to make his voice sound relaxed and carefree. Yeah, but just barely. Don't worry too much. This whole thing will be over in no time. One way or another, he added inwardly. Cassie's smile weakened. She was clearly not convinced by his clumsy attempt to reassure her. Sonny hesitated. Hey, have you ever eaten demon meat? The blind girl was clearly surprised by his question. What? No. Sonny grinned. How about a demon steak? I'm an excellent cook, I'll have you know, I think. Neff had sort of monopolized the preparation of food, so I had no chance to put all the knowledge from the wilderness survival course to practice. Teacher Julius had indeed spent a lot of time teaching him how to cook all kinds of seemingly inedible things, as well as meats of all sorts of nightmare creatures, in preparation for his journey into the dream realm. Here, hunger was as much of an enemy as the fiercest of monsters. As soon as we get our hands on some demon meat, I'll make you a steak. It'll be the most delicious demon steak you had ever eaten, I promise. Finally, a real smile appeared on Cassie's face. She gave him a courteous nod. All right, that's a promise then. Meanwhile, Nephise was done with the rope. She threw it down without hesitation and glanced at him. Are you ready? Sonny sighed and closed his eyes for a second, feeling the strength of his body being enhanced by the shadow. Yes, let's do this. As soon as their feet touched the ground, Sonny felt a heavy gaze burning a hole in his chest. Glancing up, he saw the crippled carapace demon staring right at him, a dark glint shining in his one remaining eye. The other one was gone, leaving only a bleeding black gap behind. At this distance, the damage dealt to the demon's body seemed even more debilitating. Its carapace was fractured in several places and covered in cracks, each seeping with azure blood. Sadly, none of the cracks were near the vital organs. His horns were shattered, as was one of his front legs, in addition to several rear ones that were either broken or torn off completely. The stumps of his two severed arms were pressed tight against his torso to stem the heavy bleeding. The other two were hanging to the ground, almost brushing against the ashen sand. The giant monster looked broken and tired. However, it was still terrifying, perhaps even more so than before, because despite the horrible wounds, his gaze was still firm and full of evil intelligence. It was still radiating. madness and bloodlust, which was now concentrated on Sunny and Nephis, the architects of his sorry state. The first beams of the rising sun shone on the spikes covering the demons, once lustrous carapace, painting them in shades of burning crimson. Sunny summoned the azure blade and glanced at Nephis. "Be careful, he's lightning fast." He was the only one who had seen the terrible creature in action. As such, only he knew how dangerous the demon really was. Nephis nodded, not taking her eyes off the enemy, and stepped forward. The two of them walked toward the waiting carapace demon. Sunny was slightly ahead and aiming to circle the behemoth from the right, the side, where the demon had both his last remaining scythe and eye. Changing Star was a step or two behind him, aiming to circle the creature. From the left, the side where his pincer arm was slowly rising into the air. In this battle, Sunny's role was to take the brunt of the enemy's attacks, letting his partner deal the lethal blow when the time was right. Through the tacit understanding that they had developed through surviving dozens of life or death situations, the two of them were able to cooperate without speaking, a single word fighting almost as one. This was their main advantage. As they were closing in, Sunny felt a slight shift in the demon's posture. Instantly, he knew that hell was about to break loose. He had warned Nephis about the speed of their enemy, but he also had to deal with it himself. Sunny knew that he was much slower than the giant creature, but he still had to find a way to dodge the massive, terrifying scythe. That wasn't as bad as it seemed. Speed wasn't everything in a fight. Take, for example, Changing Star's training fight against the proud scion of the Henley clan. Castor possessed an aspect ability that made him 10 times faster than the silver-haired girl, at least. However, in the end, he only won by a hair's breadth. Nephis had almost smashed his face with an unexpected elbow strike. She had been able to catch Castor unaware, not because of her fast reaction. With that big of a difference between their speeds, no amount of reaction could have helped her. Instead, she was able to predict and manipulate the opponent's attacks, starting the strike even before Castor himself knew that he was going to end up in the path of her elbow. She was in control of the battlefield, and now they had to repeat that feat against the ancient demon of the Forgotten Shore. Luckily, his speed advantage was not nearly as insane as Castor's. Almost simultaneously, Sunny and Nephis lunged forward, attacking the behemoth from different sides. He also moved, ready to tear them apart. Both his pincer and his scythe rose into the air. Sunny was running as fast as he could, the azure blade outstretched behind him. A fire of cold resolve was burning in his heart. He was ready to live or die by his blade. However, in the next moment, his leg seemed to slip in the sand, and as his eyes opened wide, Sunny stumbled. Not wasting the opportunity, the carapace demon attacked. The terrifying scythe tore through the air, aiming to cut the helpless human in half. But it hit only sand. Sunny, who had feigned his loss of balance to bait the demon's strike, easily avoided the deadly blade by jumping to the side at the last second. He wasn't quite at the level where he could predict every move of the enemy. Instead, manipulating the enemy into performing a predictable attack was easier. After all, deceit and manipulation were his forte. Temporarily safe from the threat of the scythe, Sunny dashed toward the demon's legs. At the same time, Nephis had managed to avoid the massive pincer and was closing in on them too. They reached their goals almost simultaneously, one from the right, the other from the left. Sunny slashed with the azure blade, feeling it hit the polished armor, and bounced back without leaving even a slight scratch on it. Dull pain radiated through his hands. On the other side of the behemoth's massive body, Nephis achieved more success. She had attacked the already injured front leg of the monster, cutting deep into his flesh through the wide crack in the metal plate. Severely damaged, the leg wasn't able to support the weight of the giant creature anymore. It buckled, sending the demon reeling. At this point, a scavenger or a centurion would have lost their balance and fallen to the ground. However, the carapace demon was too smart and experienced. He compensated for the loss of another leg by shifting his body weight to the opposite side and thrusting his scythe into the ground to remain stable. Damn it! Sunny had really hoped that the bastard would fall down, because then he wouldn't have had to do what he was about to do next. But now there was no other choice. Cursing inwardly, Sunny briefly looked up at the massive body of the giant demon. Heavens only knew how much that thing weighed. Then he held his breath and ducked right beneath the carapace demon's steel abdomen.